The sewing machine left my house 4 days after Eleanor's funeral, but it came back to me before sunset with a note tied to the handwheel. I had carried it into Martha Collins's parlor exactly as my wife requested, watched Martha cover the polished walnut case with both hands, and believed one final duty was finished. Then Martha's grandson returned it without explanation. The note contained only 9 words. James, she must complete the blue blanket before it moves. I had never heard of a blue blanket, and Eleanor had been dead 11 days. If you have ever discovered that grief was hiding a responsibility, stay with me. I stood in my driveway while the boy shifted uneasily beside his truck. A spool of dark blue thread rested on top of the machine, held in place by a narrow paper card. Grandma said you would understand, he told me. I don't. His eyes dropped. She said Mrs. Porter promised. That was the first moment I understood Eleanor had left instructions with people I did not know. For 46 years, the machine had occupied the front window of our spare room. Eleanor called it temperamental. I called it indestructible. During my years managing engineering contracts for the Army, I learned that old equipment rarely failed without warning. Eleanor treated that machine the same way I treated a critical pump or generator. Clean it, document every repair, and never ignore a change in sound. After retirement, I built her a cedar work table so she could sew without bending over the dining table. Since her death, I had avoided that room entirely. Now I carried the machine back inside. The card beneath the thread bore Martha's address on one side. On the other, in Eleanor's handwriting, were 3 lines. 1 winter blanket. Use the blue thread. Pass the machine before the first snow. I read the words twice. Eleanor had known the doctors could not stop her illness, yet she had never mentioned a blanket, a deadline, or any plan involving Martha Collins. My first instinct was to call Martha and demand an explanation. Instead, the habits of a lifetime took over. I examined what had been returned. The machine's brass plate was warm, though no one had used it in my house. A fresh strip of fabric clung beneath the presser foot. The stitches were uneven, stopping abruptly after 6 inches. Martha had tried to begin the project and failed. Then I noticed a shallow compartment beneath the wooden base. I had repaired that cabinet myself and never seen it open. Inside lay a folded transfer card, yellowed at the edges, bearing 7 women's names from 7 different towns. Eleanor's appeared last. Below her name was Martha Collins. Below Martha's was an empty line. And beside that empty line, someone had written a date only 9 days away. The empty line on the transfer card occupied my thoughts long after Martha's grandson drove away. Eleanor had planned everything with careful precision throughout our marriage, from balancing household accounts to organizing church meal deliveries. Yet she had never mentioned a tradition that apparently stretched across 7 towns and depended on an old sewing machine leaving one home for another before the first snow. The next morning, I carried the machine back to Martha's farmhouse instead of calling ahead. She answered the door wearing a denim apron dusted with white batting. Her eyes immediately settled on the blue thread resting on top of the walnut case. "She sent it back," Martha whispered, sounding disappointed rather than surprised. "You couldn't finish the blanket," I replied gently. Martha lowered her gaze. "Not these hands." Arthritis had twisted her fingers until even turning the doorknob looked painful. She invited me inside, where unfinished quilt squares covered the dining table. Every piece carried the same deep blue stitching Eleanor had favored during her final autumn. "Why blue?" I asked. Martha smiled faintly. Because blue keeps families warm long after winter ends. It sounded more like something Eleanor would have said than a practical explanation. Martha opened a small tin beside her sewing basket and removed several fabric labels, each neatly embroidered with a single family name. None belonged to the women listed on the transfer card. Instead, they belonged to military families, widows, and grandparents raising children after deployments or unexpected losses. Every completed blanket carried one label before the sewing machine continued its journey. "Eleanor never sold these?" I asked. Martha looked almost offended. "Sold them? James, nobody here ever charged a penny." My understanding shifted, but not enough to reveal the whole picture. Before I could ask another question, Martha carefully unfolded a faded notebook filled with short handwritten entries. Each page listed only a date, a town, the first name of a woman, and one sentence describing a blanket's destination. Twin boys after their father's funeral, young widow through the January storm, grandmother raising 3 children. Eleanor's name appeared dozens of times over nearly 20 years, always followed by the same simple notation: machine passed forward. I found myself smiling through grief. For the first time since Eleanor died, I could picture her doing something I had never witnessed, quietly serving people she believed deserved privacy more than recognition. Then I reached the final completed page. Beneath Eleanor's last entry, someone had written only 3 words in unfamiliar handwriting: mountain route pending. The next page had been torn out completely. Martha noticed me staring at the missing sheet and shook her head before I even spoke. It disappeared the week Eleanor passed. "Who removed it?" She answered too quickly. "I don't know." Yet she avoided my eyes, and after a long silence she added something that fit nowhere with everything else I had learned. "Someone has been asking whether the sewing machine is finally available to keep." I thanked Martha for the notebook, returned it exactly where she had kept it, and told her I had no intention of troubling anyone else. That much was true, at least on the surface. Years of supervising Army engineering contracts had taught me that people relaxed once they believed an inspection had ended. If someone had removed the missing page, openly chasing answers would only encourage them to hide more. So I chose patience instead. Before leaving, I carried the sewing machine back to my truck and told Martha I would simply store it until winter passed. Relief flickered across her face, followed almost immediately by disappointment. "Eleanor wouldn't have wanted that," she murmured. "Maybe not," I answered, "but I need time." By sunset, word had quietly spread through the neighboring towns that James Porter had decided to end Eleanor's old sewing tradition. I suspected that was exactly what the unseen observer wanted to hear. The following morning, I drove to Ash Creek, where Grace Whitmore coordinated a volunteer quilting room inside the community center. Eleanor had mentioned Grace only once, years earlier, after helping repair flood-damaged blankets. Grace welcomed me warmly, but never seemed surprised that I arrived carrying the blue spool of thread. Instead, she smiled sadly. "So it finally reached you." What reached me? The responsibility. She invited me into a workroom lined with folded quilts, donated fabric, and carefully labeled shelves. Nothing about the room suggested secrecy, yet every volunteer greeted the old sewing machine with quiet respect instead of curiosity. Grace opened a narrow cabinet and removed a weathered ledger no larger than a church hymnal. "This doesn't leave this room." Inside were names stretching back nearly 50 years, not families receiving blankets, women receiving the sewing machine. Beside each name appeared only 3 entries: received, completed, passed. No addresses, no explanations, no signatures beyond first names. The tradition had survived because it trusted ordinary people rather than organizations. I found Eleanor's entry. Received, October 2003. Completed, November 2003. Passed. Pending. Pending, I asked. Grace nodded slowly. She became ill before she could finish the final transfer. But Martha said she passed it on. She passed the machine. Grace rested one finger on the unfinished line. Not the responsibility. For several seconds, I believed I finally understood the mystery. Eleanor's illness had interrupted the chain. The missing notebook page simply contained the next recipient's name. Once we found that woman, everything could continue. It was such a reasonable conclusion that I almost stopped asking questions. Grace quietly closed the ledger. James, I looked up. That's not what worries me. She walked to a filing cabinet and removed a small envelope containing several transfer cards identical to the one hidden beneath Eleanor's sewing machine. One card stood apart from the others. Its corner had been neatly cut away. Every legitimate transfer card carries the blue thread mark, Grace explained. This one doesn't. Who made it? I don't know. She hesitated before continuing. But 2 weeks before Eleanor died, Daniel Briggs visited this center, asking whether the sewing machine could become the permanent centerpiece of the Heritage Textile Museum. I've heard of him. Everyone has. He wanted to preserve local history. Grace gave a tired smile. That's what I believed too. She slid another card toward me. Someone had carefully copied Eleanor's handwriting. Almost perfectly. Only one instruction was different. Instead of pass the machine before the first snow, it read, donate the machine permanently. The forgery was good enough to fool almost anyone. Almost. Then Grace turned the counterfeit card over. On the back was the missing destination Eleanor never had the chance to write. And someone had deliberately covered the town's name with fresh blue ink. I carried the counterfeit transfer card home and placed it beside Eleanor's handwritten original beneath the lamp in her sewing room. At first glance, they looked identical. The same careful loops, the same quiet phrasing. Even the paper had been aged to resemble the older cards. But years of reviewing engineering contracts had trained my eyes to notice consistency more than appearance. Eleanor always crossed the letter T with a short, level stroke. The forged card slanted upward ever so slightly. It was a tiny difference, but it proved something larger. Whoever copied her writing had practiced long enough to imitate her style without truly becoming her. I resisted the temptation to confront Daniel Briggs. If he had only admired the sewing machine, accusing him now would accomplish nothing except warning the real culprit. Instead, I visited the County Historical Archive, where Eleanor had occasionally volunteered to restore old church textiles. The archivist recognized her name immediately and led me into a climate-controlled storage room filled with boxed records from local charities. Eleanor never cared much about preserving objects, the archivist said while searching an index. She always asked how people were using them. That sentence unsettled me because it contradicted everything I had begun to believe. Until then, I assumed the sewing machine itself carried extraordinary significance. Yet everyone who had actually worked beside Eleanor described the machine as nothing more than a useful tool. The legacy was never the walnut cabinet. It was the promise attached to it. The archive contained several donation files from regional veterans relief groups. One folder included copies of blanket deliveries dating back decades. The signatures matched first names from Grace's ledger. Another folder held photographs of winter distributions after severe storms. Families smiled beneath handmade blue quilts, but no organization claimed credit. Every image simply listed volunteers. Then I discovered something I had completely misunderstood. The blankets were never assigned after requests for help. They were already finished before anyone knew who would need them. The women prepared for hardship instead of reacting to it. That changed everything. The tradition wasn't charity. It was readiness. Exactly the lesson the Army had spent my career teaching through planning and logistics. Suddenly, Eleanor's quiet devotion made perfect sense. She wasn't waiting for emergencies. She was making sure no family faced one alone. As I left the archive, my phone rang. Grace spoke before I could say hello. "James, where's the sewing machine?" "At my house." "It shouldn't be." "I know." "No," she said, her voice tightening. "You don't understand. Someone came this morning asking whether you had already delivered it to the Heritage Textile Museum." I stopped walking. "Did they say who sent them?" "They claimed Daniel Briggs authorized the pickup." I drove directly to the Heritage Textile Museum instead of returning home. Daniel greeted me warmly, offered coffee, and proudly showed me displays of antique spinning wheels, Civil War uniforms, and restored quilts. Nothing about him suggested deception. He listened patiently while I described Eleanor's tradition. When I finished, he folded his hands. "I've admired your wife's work for years." "So you did ask about the sewing machine?" "I did." "Why?" "Because people deserve to see it." His answer sounded sincere. Too sincere. As I prepared to leave, my attention drifted toward a framed exhibition proposal resting on his desk. Attached to it was a budget request for a new permanent display. Across the top, typed in bold letters, were 6 words that forced me to rethink the entire investigation. The Eleanor Porter Legacy Collection. Someone wasn't trying to steal one old sewing machine. Someone intended to end its journey forever by turning a living tradition into a museum exhibit. I walked out without revealing what I had learned. When I reached home less than an hour later, the front door stood slightly open. The sewing room was empty. The machine was gone. I searched every room before I allowed myself to believe the sewing machine had truly been taken. Nothing else was missing. Eleanor's cedar work table remained exactly where I had built it years earlier. Her fabric bins sat untouched. Even the blue spool of thread had been left behind on the table, as though whoever entered my house wanted only the machine and nothing connected to the work itself. That detail bothered me more than the theft. Someone understood the difference between the object and the tradition. They had taken the tool while overlooking the evidence that gave it meaning. The sheriff's deputy who responded treated the disappearance politely, but without urgency. An antique sewing machine worth little on the open market rarely justified an extensive investigation. I couldn't blame him. I deliberately avoided mentioning the forged transfer card or the notebook. Those belonged to people who had trusted Eleanor for decades. Until I understood the full picture, exposing their quiet network would only place them under unnecessary scrutiny. After the deputy left, Grace arrived carrying 2 folded blankets. She spread them across Eleanor's work table without speaking. One had been stitched 18 years earlier, the other only 3 months before Eleanor died. "They're almost identical," I observed. Grace nodded. turned them over. Hidden beneath the corner binding of each blanket was a narrow strip of blue cloth no larger than my thumb. Inside the seam, stitched so carefully it was almost invisible, rested a tiny embroidered number 2148. "They aren't decoration," Grace said softly. "They're transfer numbers." I frowned. I thought every blanket simply moved with the sewing machine. Grace shook her head. "No, every completed blanket quietly records where the machine should travel next." The realization struck me with uncomfortable force. The machine had never been guiding the tradition. The blankets had. Each finished project carried the map for the next delivery. If someone possessed enough completed blankets, they could reconstruct nearly every transfer without owning a single notebook. At first, I believed the theft had destroyed Eleanor's final mission. Instead, I discovered the evidence had been hidden in plain sight for decades. Relief lasted only a moment. Grace unfolded a third blanket. Its blue marker had been cut away. "Where did this come from?" I asked. "The Heritage Textile Museum." Silence settled between us. Daniel Briggs had publicly displayed the blanket as part of a veterans exhibit only weeks earlier. Someone had deliberately removed the stitched transfer marker before placing it on display, not to preserve history, to erase direction. I suddenly understood why the missing notebook page mattered so much. Without the transfer markers and the final destination, the journey could end naturally while appearing accidental. Grace looked exhausted. "The Mountain family is still waiting. Do they know?" "No." "When's the first snow expected?" 3 days. The deadline I had considered symbolic became painfully real. Somewhere beyond the mountains, a family expecting Eleanor's final blanket would receive nothing unless the chain resumed immediately. For the first time since Eleanor's funeral, grief gave way to anger. Not loud anger. The quiet kind that settles into a man after he realizes someone has mistaken patience for surrender. I drove to the museum before sunset, but Daniel was attending a regional fundraising dinner. Instead of forcing my way into explanations, I walked through the public gallery one more time. Near the veterans' textile display stood a shipping crate addressed to the museum archives. The inventory tag listed donated quilts scheduled for permanent storage after the upcoming exhibition closed. At the bottom of the manifest appeared one handwritten edition that had not been typed with the others. Incoming item: Porter sewing machine. No accession number, no donor signature. Only one delivery date: tomorrow morning. Someone expected the stolen machine to arrive openly, as though its journey had already ended. I folded the copy of the shipping manifest into my pocket and quietly left the building. For the first time, I stopped trying to recover Eleanor's sewing machine. Instead, I began planning how to save the tradition before everyone believed the museum owned it forever. That night, I spread every piece of evidence across Eleanor's cedar work table instead of chasing the stolen sewing machine. The forged transfer card rested beside the authentic one. Grace's ledger lay open beside the museum shipping manifest. 3 blankets displayed their hidden blue markers, while the spool of thread sat alone in the center, like a compass pointing somewhere I had not yet learned to see. During my years overseeing Army infrastructure projects, I had learned a difficult lesson. When equipment disappeared, the object rarely revealed the truth. The paperwork surrounding it always did. Eleanor had quietly reached the same conclusion long before I ever recognized it. By dawn, I had stopped asking who possessed the sewing machine. The better question was who now controlled the story surrounding it. Grace arrived carrying a cardboard box filled with folded blankets collected from women across 3 neighboring towns. Together we inspected every hidden transfer marker. Each embroidered number matched an entry in the ledger. Even blankets completed decades apart fit into one continuous sequence. Track after track, year after year, no missing numbers. Until we reached the final blanket Eleanor had completed. Its transfer marker had never been sewn into the binding. Instead, tucked beneath the unfinished edge was a tiny folded strip of paper. Not a destination. A signature. Eleanor Porter. Dated only 8 days before she died. "I've never seen that before," Grace whispered. Neither had I. The note contained just one sentence. "If the machine ever stops moving, let the blankets speak for it." For the first time, Track A became something stronger. The blankets themselves documented the entire chain of custody. Combined with Grace's ledger, Martha's notebook, the transfer cards, and the museum shipping manifest, they established an uninterrupted record stretching across nearly 5 decades. The evidence no longer depended on recovering the sewing machine. It depended on preserving the truth. I made certified copies of every ledger page, photographed each transfer marker, and asked every living recipient to sign a dated statement confirming when she received and passed the machine. No accusations appeared anywhere in the documents, only verified history. By evening, the collection filled 2 organized binders. Grace watched me close the final binder. "You really think this matters more than finding the machine?" "It already does." Late that afternoon, Daniel Briggs called for the first time. His voice remained calm. "James, I heard someone entered the museum yesterday asking unusual questions. I visited. I wish you'd spoken with me longer." "So do I." He paused. "The sewing machine belongs where everyone can appreciate Eleanor's generosity." "It never belonged to Eleanor." Silence. Then he answered carefully. "History disappears when people refuse to preserve it." I almost agreed with him. His argument contained enough truth to persuade anyone who didn't understand the tradition. A museum could preserve the walnut cabinet. It could never preserve the obligation that required ordinary people to keep using it. Before ending the call, Daniel offered one final compromise. "If the machine arrives tomorrow, I'll dedicate the entire exhibit to your wife." I looked at Eleanor's handwritten note. "If it arrives tomorrow," I replied quietly, "its journey dies tomorrow." After we hung up, Grace stared at me. "Are you going to stop him?" "Not yet." I sealed copies of every statement inside envelopes addressed to the County Historical Board, the Veterans Relief Council, and the museum trustees. None would be opened unless necessary. Then I deliberately did nothing. By remaining silent, I allowed Daniel to believe the forged transfer card had succeeded. The machine would arrive without resistance, and no one else understood what was truly at stake. Waiting carried its own cost. Somewhere beyond the mountains, a family still expected the final blue blanket before the first snow. Had I waited too long to protect Eleanor's promise? The museum's board meeting began the following afternoon beneath banners celebrating the county's history, and for the first 20 minutes I remained nothing more than another grieving widower seated quietly in the back row. Daniel Briggs stood confidently beside a display easel covered with architectural drawings for the new Eleanor Porter Legacy Collection. His proposal was polished, respectful, and persuasive. He spoke warmly about preserving craftsmanship, honoring volunteers, and ensuring future generations would never forget Eleanor's generosity. Listening to him, I understood why almost everyone supported the exhibit. He was not lying about its beauty. He was simply telling an incomplete truth. When Daniel announced that the antique sewing machine had already been secured for permanent preservation, several trustees applauded. That was when I stood. I believe the board deserves to see the rest of Eleanor's legacy. Daniel smiled politely. Of course, James. He expected memories. Instead, I carried 2 binders to the front table. One contained certified copies of Grace's ledger, Martha's notebook entries, transfer cards, volunteer statements, museum shipping records, and photographs of every surviving blanket marker. The second contained only photographs. 48 blankets, 48 hidden blue transfer numbers, 48 completed journeys. I never accused Daniel of theft. I simply asked every trustee to compare the documents in chronological order. At first, the room remained quiet. Then questions began. One trustee noticed the museum inventory listed the sewing machine before any lawful donation had been approved. Another recognized that the transfer markers disappeared only from blankets already displayed by the museum. Grace calmly explained how each blanket recorded the next destination. Martha described the unwritten promise every widow accepted before touching the machine. One by one, elderly volunteers rose from their seats. None delivered dramatic speeches. Each quietly confirmed receiving the sewing machine, completing one blanket, and passing both forward. No story contradicted another. The evidence supported every memory. Daniel finally interrupted. I never intended harm. I believe you, I answered. The room fell silent again. I believed preserving the machine would inspire more people. So did I. He looked relieved. Then I placed Eleanor's final handwritten note on the table. If the machine ever stops moving, let the blankets speak for it. Daniel stared at the sentence for several long seconds. You knew, he whispered. I know now. His shoulders slowly lowered. I thought museums protected history. They protect objects. I rested my hand on the binder. Eleanor protected people. A trustee quietly asked the question none of us had yet answered. Where is the sewing machine? Daniel closed his eyes. In museum storage. No one gasped, no one shouted. Because the answer changed almost nothing. The binders had already established the truth. The machine no longer carried the tradition. The people did. Still, one final complication remained. The museum registrar admitted the incoming crate had already been processed with a permanent accession number that would legally transfer ownership unless withdrawn before business closed that evening. Daniel looked at the clock. Only 40 minutes remained. Without waiting for permission, he turned toward the registrar. Cancel the accession. The paperwork's already filed. Then reverse it. You'll answer to the donors. I'll answer. For the first time since Eleanor's funeral, Daniel made a decision that cost him something. The registrar hurried downstairs while the trustees voted unanimously to suspend the exhibit pending review. Grace squeezed my arm. It's enough. I slowly shook my head. No. Outside, heavy gray clouds rolled across the mountains. The first snow had begun. Somewhere beyond those ridges, a family still waited for Eleanor's final blue blanket. The sewing machine had been recovered. The tradition had been saved. But until that unfinished blanket reached its destination, Eleanor's last promise remained incomplete. The snow reached the mountain road before we did, but it never reached the family ahead of us. Grace finished Eleanor's final blue blanket through the night, while Martha carefully stitched the last hidden transfer marker into its corner. I carried the antique sewing machine in the back of my truck, not because the blanket required it anymore, but because I finally understood what Eleanor had wanted me to see. The machine had never been the inheritance. It was simply the traveler that carried kindness from one pair of hands to another. The family waiting in the mountain valley never knew how close the tradition had come to ending. They welcomed us with quiet gratitude, believing only that neighbors had remembered them before winter settled in. I watched Grace hand over the folded blanket without speeches or ceremony. Hidden inside the binding, the small blue marker carried one new number and one new destination. The journey was already continuing. Afterward, I placed the sewing machine on the farmhouse porch. Not inside my truck. Not back inside my home. A young widow named Rebecca stepped forward, running her fingers across the worn walnut cabinet, exactly as Eleanor once had. "I'll take good care of her," she whispered. I smiled. "Don't." She looked confused. "Take good care of the next family." Understanding slowly replaced surprise. She nodded once. "I will." A week later, the museum trustees formally withdrew the permanent exhibit proposal. Daniel Briggs resigned as director and publicly acknowledged that preserving a living tradition required humility as much as stewardship. The museum created a small display honoring the women who quietly served their communities, but the sewing machine itself never appeared behind glass. Its place remained on the road. Back in my sewing room, Eleanor's cedar work table stood empty except for the blue spool of thread she had left behind. For the first time since her funeral, I closed the room's door without sadness. The thread stayed with me, but the sewing machine belonged to the future. If this story reminded you that the greatest legacies are often carried by ordinary people instead of treasured possessions, I hope you'll join us again for another quiet valor story. Until then, may you find the courage to protect what truly matters, the wisdom to recognize quiet acts of kindness, and the blessing of leaving behind a legacy that keeps moving long after you're gone.